Hello, everyone. Hi. Hi, Paul, and hi, Susan.
Okay, can you hear me now? Betty, can you hear me? Oh, can someone confirm that you can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, good. I just wanted to make sure because I didn't have any replies, so
Sorry. I just, yeah, thanks.
it's fine. Perfect. Thank you.
Can anyone hear me?
Yes, I can.
Right. Talk to you later.
Yep.
People are in the meeting room already, and the event will start in 1 minute. Okay, I think our guests are almost here, and I will start from now. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Jiayou Guo, the founder of TDDA. Thanks for being here with us. The number of participants today is highly more than our expectation. We are very excited to have such an opportunity to have the discussion about the relationship between Taiwan and Europe through the perspective of human rights and public diplomacy. And Taiwan Digital Diplomacy Association, we are the partner of My Name, My Right movement for almost 2 years. And during the years, we have been raising the awareness of Taiwanese partnership in different regions through social and mass media. We believe the movement is not only about defending the rights of nationality, but also promoting the content of Taiwan to Europe and the international community. In recent years, we can see that cross-strait relation, which used to be viewed as a regional dispute, has become an international issue. Taiwan is critical to whether the world's freedom and democracy declines or advances in the next decade. By holding this event, we hope we can encourage more conversation between Taiwanese and Europe, which is the promoter of human rights and democracy in the international world. It's our honor to have Mr. Philip, Dr. Ferenczi, and Dr. Liao as our speakers. I believe in today's event, we can collect more comprehensive perspective for the future of Taiwan-Europe relation. Wish everyone a wonderful evening. Thank you. And let's welcome Joseph, the founder of My Name, My Rights movement, to give us more words. Joseph?
Okay. Thank you, Jiayou. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, good evening, good afternoon, and also good morning. It is indeed my great pleasure to welcome you all to this webinar. My name is Joseph, the initiator of the Taiwan My Name, My Right movement. I'm a Taiwanese lawyer, currently a freelancer living in Norway. I remember I first came to Norway to study in the master program of Theory and Practice of Human Rights at the University of Oslo in 2015. Since my childhood, Norway has long been my dream country because I was a book fan of the Norwegian author Jostein Gaarde. He is well known for writing philosophical fiction for teenagers, including The Sophie's World. The book has actually guided me to ponder philosophical questions like, who am I? And where does the world come from? Today, I believe those questions have led me to initiate this movement in Norway. The background of this movement, as you may know, is because the citizenship of Taiwanese residents here was forcefully registered as China by the Norwegian government. The nationality on the new version of our resident cards is currently shown as Chen-En, which means the People's Republic of China. However, it was not until I arrived in Norway that I realized all Taiwanese must be registered as PRC citizens on our residence documentations. According to a report of Aftenposten, the registration of Taiwanese as Chinese by the Norwegian government started in June 2010, which was in the same year Liu Xiaobo received the Nobel Peace Prize. This policy change is directly linked to the Norwegian Foreign Minister Jonas Gahr Støre's reply to the parliament in March of the same year. Let me quote his reply here. Norway is pursuing a one China policy. Norway recognizes the People's Republic of China, of which Taiwan is a part of under international law. Accordingly, Taiwan does not have its own country status. This is the basis for our policy toward Taiwan and the assessments made regarding the relationship with the Taipei Representative Office in Norway. However, even this kind of pleasing statement couldn't save Norway from China's retaliation. After the Norwegian Nobel Committee insisted on awarding the Peace Prize to Liu, China had blocked imports of Norwegian salmon and other products and canceled all economic and cultural exchanges with Norway for 6 years. In my opinion, this Peace Prize incident was a successful experiment for China to exert its sharp power against a highly developed Western country. It's also a typical trade war against a NATO country 8 years earlier than the one initiated by the Trump administration. But this incident did not receive as much attention outside of Norway at that time. Frustrated by the joint statement, I finally decided to pursue legal remedies for our right to personal identity. After consulting with my teachers and local lawyers, I represented myself and 9 other Taiwanese residents to file a complaint to the Norwegian Immigration Authority in March 2017. It was the start of our legal journey in Norway. During the High Court procedure, we have asked our Taiwanese Facebook fans who live in Europe to provide photos of their residence cards as evidence to support our arguments. Surprisingly, among the 17 European countries that we received, only Norway and Spain registered Taiwanese as citizens of China or Chen-En. There are some special cases like Luxembourg, which use Chinese Taiwan for its Taiwanese residents, while Romania says that our citizenship is, in quotes, others in Asia. All other European countries register their Taiwanese residents as citizens of Taiwan or TWN. After the Supreme Court of Norway ruled that our case it is not clear that the appeal cannot proceed in November last year, I started to contact other European legal experts in this area. Fortunately, I have invited Ms. Shona Jolie, the Queen's Counsel, and Professor Joe Marshall to join our legal team to apply our case with the European Court of Human Rights. We were very confident that our more than 700-page application is strong and credible. To be honest, I was totally heartbroken by the decision of the European Court to claim our application manifestly ill-founded. Without engaging with the substance of our legal points and even communicating them to the Norwegian government, the court's treatment against us, if not all Taiwanese people, is rough and reckless. However, I still believe the action of our pursuit for justice already carries some weight for Taiwan's struggle in the bigger picture. Although we couldn't now at this time, at least we have tried our best to display a counter-strength against Chinese pressure. I hope this can be an example for other Taiwanese and encourages them to challenge the unfair treatment against Taiwan by the international community. Unfortunately, my observation is that most people here in Europe perceive Taiwan only as a part of the confrontation between the US and China, which they prefer not to take sides in. Due to geopolitics, European countries seem not to have to face the consequence of China's bad behaviors directly. But facing the explicit ambition of China, recently, the European attitude toward China is changing. So I hope the Europeans can also notice the importance of Taiwan in a world trend of democracy recession. If the rights of Taiwanese people under international law are not appealing enough for your support, at least the liberal values that Taiwanese people strive for and present today should be cherished by the camp of democracies without a doubt. Even if Taiwan couldn't become a normal country like others in the future, I still hope our movement will become a part of the history of a small democracy fought against the biggest totalitarian regime at that time. And I hope the end of that story is not China successfully manipulated other democratic countries to become accomplices of annihilating Taiwan. Finally, I would like to express my sincere thanks to all the dedicated colleagues of TDDA who have worked very hard to ensure the success of this webinar. I wish the event a great success and all guests and participants a most rewarding and enjoyable time. Thank you very much.
you, Joseph. Hello, everyone. Let me welcome you again to this webinar. My name is Raymond Song. I'm honored to be your moderator for tonight's event. We live in an interesting time. The world's interest in Taiwan is increasing, but we also are bound by the previous existing geopolitical boundaries, as a case illustrated so well by Joseph for us. And we are very excited to have this discussion tonight about how do we draw closer relationship between EU countries and European countries and Taiwan, and especially from the human rights angle. We see that recently several interesting developments. For example, given that China raised very harsh sanctions against the speaker who speak out, scholars and EU parliamentaries who speak out against the human rights dealings issued by China in Xinjiang province, that China sanctions those individuals, and those events get a very harsh response from the EU Parliament. And we see that the EU and Taiwan shares values on human rights. Of course, Taiwan is a vibrant democracy. And so we are dealing with tonight about from several angles, from IR angles, from the IL angles, especially human rights, and from the how do we get closer knowledge to the EU human rights system. And I encourage every participant. We have a large audience tonight, today, and from every many corners of the world. I encourage you to raise the questions by typing into the discussion room of this webinar, and we at this end will organize all those questions and to organize those in accordance with the common things. And we will reserve about 1 hour for discussion. And the most lively discussion in Taiwan is in its civil societies, and especially we have a very wide audience, especially from the younger generations. We expect very good discussions in the latter hour. But in the first hour, we have 3 excellent scholars and researchers to present themes to discuss how do we draw closer tie between EU and Taiwan. The first speaker is Johann Philip Engström, who is a MOF Taiwan scholar and who have intimate knowledge in Taiwan and EU policy, who will speak to us about how do we draw closer ties from the IR's angle. So I'll give the floor to you, Philip, please.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my PowerPoint and let's get started. Start my video here too. So thank you all. Thank you first for that introduction, and thank you for the invitation here. With that, let's just jump straight into it. And here's the topic of my talk: Taiwan's current role in EU-Taiwan relations. So over the next 20 minutes or so, I am going to be talking to you about the way that the EU matters to Taiwan matters to the EU, but also the ways in which it doesn't matter, and perhaps also the ways that it should matter. And I'll be closing towards the end with a little bit of discussion about what you, the audience, can do to help do something about this. So just to start, we need to think about what kind of policies and interests that circumscribe the roles that Taiwan can play to the EU. And this is important because Taiwan, as we've heard, is very much seen as a part of China policy in the European Union, and less so as an issue on its own, a partner for its own merits. And we need to pay particular attention to 2 things. The first is this quote, that the EU confirms its one China policy from the elements for a new EU strategy on China, which is to say, as we all know, that the European Union recognizes the People's Republic of China as the sole government of China and not the Republic of China. And also that the EU does not, or member states, have formal diplomatic relations with Taiwan. This, of course, limits the number of topics and issues that the EU can cooperate with Taiwan on, as we'll see more concretely later. The second thing we need to consider is EU attitudes towards China. And I think those are well expressed by this quote from the EU-China Strategic Outlook document, which is to say that China is both a cooperation partner, a negotiation partner, an economic competitor, and a systemic rival. What you can take away from this is very much that although EU attitudes towards China have grown more negative in recent years, they're still very much ambivalent rather than antagonistic. And this shapes the way that the EU cooperates with Taiwan, because of course, China is very likely to do backlash against the EU if it sees cooperation with Taiwan as violating its interests. And thus, the EU will be cautious in some circumstances to cooperate with Taiwan. We will see more of that later. But again, it's not always the case that China is all that hostile towards all the ties between the EU and Taiwan. Culture, education, exchanges in science and research are not that controversial to China, and the EU and Taiwan have been able to build up relations there. So that's one first role that Taiwan plays for the EU. Another kind of relationship that is not all that controversial to China is purely economic ties. And that brings us to the first major role that Taiwan plays to the EU, and that is this. Taiwan is an economic partner to the EU. So the two sides hold regular consultations on trade, the digital economy, and industrial policy, which is very important in fomenting and fostering the economic ties between the two countries. And Taiwan, actually, as you can see from this chart, is actually a pretty important economic partner to the EU. Bilateral trade in 2019 amounted to over 50 billion euros, which made Taiwan the fifth most important partner to the EU in Asia, and the 15th most important internationally. And as you can see, trade was also fairly balanced. That, though, is not the case when we talk about foreign direct investment stocks between the EU and Taiwan. As you can see here, the EU has pretty substantial investment in Taiwan, actually makes it one of the largest partners for Taiwan. Taiwanese FDI in the Eurozone, though, not so much, less than 2% of Taiwan's total FDI. And that's actually a problem for the European Union. And we've seen that highlighted over the past year with the coronavirus pandemic. Namely, because this has highlighted the vulnerability of supply chains, and especially those relating to semiconductors, which has been quite detrimental to the European auto industry in particular. And the European Union recognizes this and wants Taiwan to be a more stable partner in terms of supply chains. And that's a role that it wants to foster and has tried to foster with EU-Taiwan investment forums, one which was held last year and one which is going to be held this year, and other workshops with the EU and Japan. That said, it's really a question whether this is enough. And a lot of experts think the following, namely that for Taiwan to really flourish in this role as an economic partner to the EU, what's needed is a bilateral investment agreement between Taiwan and the EU. And the EU has actually said it wants to negotiate one. It did so in 2015, but it's dragged its feet. And the question now is, will one be negotiated? And the fact is that one may be, but only once talks for a comprehensive agreement on investment with China are done. That's what then Trade Commissioner Cecilia Malmström said in October 2015. And as of yet, this still remains the case. The EU says that it will not negotiate a BIA with Taiwan before it does a comprehensive agreement on investment with China. The negotiations which are currently frozen due to problems relating to Xinjiang and mutual exchanges of sanctions. And, you know, for me, I would like to add this as one way in which EU-Taiwan relation needs to be developed. The problem is that this prevents Taiwan from playing a more constructive geopolitical role in EU-Taiwan relations, one that it should play, in my opinion. And that is simply flowing from the fact that the EU wants to promote economic liberal values in Asia. It wants to promote its values. And Taiwan, being one of the freest economies in Asia, is an ideal partner for doing this. Allowing China to prevent this from happening, I think, is a bad geopolitical mistake, and one that we, both in Taiwan and in Europe, really need to be thinking about what we can do, and especially thus by strengthening the relationship between Taiwan and the EU with the BIA. That said, moving on, we need also to note that economic values are not everything that Taiwan and the EU have in common. There's also political values like democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. Both sides have a commitment to upholding multilateralism and the rules-based world order. And finally, they share objectives like security, stability, sustainable growth, and things like fighting the COVID pandemic. And these commonalities bring us to the next role that Taiwan plays for the EU. That is to say, it's a partner to the EU in areas of mutual interest, or in the words of the European Economic and Trade Office, Taiwan is a reliable and valued like-minded partner in Asia. And there's actually some cooperation going on here. And first of all, and most of all, and with respect to democracy and human rights, with annual human rights consultations, which I'm sure we'll hear more about later, and also judicial exchange programs to promote the rule of law. There's also what you see here, the EU-Taiwan Gender Equality and Human Rights Training Course, which has been going on for a while. There is the EU-Taiwan LGBTI Human Rights Conference, which has also been held. And then there are things like labor, with the EU-Taiwan Labor Consultation, which is another area of cooperation, also expressed, for example, in this workshop on working and living conditions for fishers. And finally, climate change and environment is another area where Taiwan and the EU share a lot of values and interests and have done some exchange of opinion and cooperation. For example, here with the Climate Action Week in 2018, and also this fun picture from a Taiwan and a European Union officials work to clean up a beach in Taiwan to draw attention to climate change. With respect to multilateralism, it's a bit more complicated because, as we know, Taiwan is excluded from a lot of international organizations because of China. But that said, the EU has said that it should promote practical solutions regarding Taiwan's participation in international frameworks, as expressed here. And it has done so, for example, during the coronavirus pandemic, by liaising with other democracies to promote Taiwan's, part of Taiwan's participation in World Health Organization working groups, and also in the World Health Assembly, although that hasn't really happened yet because of Chinese resistance. This is all very good and important cooperation, although as you can tell, it is rather limited and often quite limited to things like workshops and consultations. And I would like to point this out, that unfortunately, the EU is a bit reluctant to allow Taiwan to play this role to the extent that it can, given the extent of shared values and interests. And there are several ways in which we can see this. The first is that the EU has focused very narrowly when it comes to promoting Taiwan's participation in international organizations. It has focused mostly on the World Health Organization and Assembly, but not really put all that much energy towards promoting Taiwan's participation in things like the International Civil Aviation Organization or the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And this is a big shame, of course, because Taiwan's absence leads to gaps in the coverage of international frameworks, which can only hurt the EU's multilateral ambitions and international interests. Another thing is this, limited EU participation in the Global Training and Cooperation Framework. This is a forum set up by the US, Japan, and Taiwan to help Taiwan share its expertise internationally in topical areas like cybersecurity, public health, women's empowerment, and disaster management. Seeing that and allowing Taiwan to do that is an interest of the EU, at least I would say so, in the sense that Taiwan does share objectives with the EU, and having it reach a wider global audience would very much be a way to help strengthen the chorus of voices internationally working towards goals that the EU supports. The EU, though, has only participated or co-hosted one of these workshops organized through the GTCF, although Sweden and the Netherlands, two of its member states, have co-hosted as well. More needs to be done, though, especially as China hasn't really been all that punitive towards countries participating in the Global Training and Cooperation Framework. So more can be done. Finally, I would also point out that EU is hesitant to cooperate with Taiwan in several areas in which the two share interests. And these, of course, are mostly areas which have sort of a geopolitical import, and also areas where cooperations can be seen as be construed as being a bit anti-China. With that said, though, the EU has a lot to gather from cooperation like this. And I would especially point to the area of disinformation, because as we know, disinformation poses a great threat to democracy, both in the EU and Taiwan. Taiwan, though, has been very successful in combating this issue, and also sits on a wealth of knowledge, in particular about Chinese disinformation, which is a growing threat to the EU. And as such, the EU ought to want to see more exchange of best practices. Unfortunately, so far, we haven't really seen this, except for some base level discussions in the context of human rights consultations. Another area is connectivity, that is building transport, human and digital links. There are a lot of synergies to be made between the EU's Connecting Asia and Europe strategy and Taiwan's new southbound policy. But again, since the former is sometimes seen as a rival to the China's BRI initiative, the Belt and Road Initiative, and the new southbound policy, of course, is seen as a way for Taiwan to diversify its economy away from China. It's a bit complicated, and we haven't really seen that cooperation really take off yet. Finally, there's maritime security, which is a really important topic, especially as we're seeing China start to develop its geoeconomic chokehold on the South China Sea through aggressive sovereignty claims and also a strong naval and military presence there. I think, at least in my opinion, the EU and Taiwan have an interest in preventing this and ensuring free and open Indo-Pacific and safe sea lanes there. And we have seen some interest in the EU to have Taiwan participate in maritime security, for example, in the context of the new EU Indo-Pacific strategy, but not that much. And it's unlikely to reach sovereignty issues because of the obvious provocations that would pose towards China. So again, here, there are roles that Taiwan could play for a Europe that wants to be more assertive geopolitically, but we're unlikely to see it because of the limitations that we discussed before. But while Taiwan may not be a security partner to the EU, and is unlikely to be such in the future, we do need to know this, that Taiwan is a security issue for the EU. And we can see this from quotes like this, uttered by ex-Commissioner of Humanitarian Aid and Crisis Management, Christos Stylianides, in January 2010, during a debate in the European Parliament on cross-strait relations. He says here that he knows that a conflict in the Taiwan Strait would have a negative impact on our own security, as well as on our trade and our economies. And that is very accurate, of course, because of the obvious risks that a potential conflict in the Taiwan Strait, which could pull in the US, would have on international economics and also on the credibility of US defense guarantees. That said, when looked at from this perspective, how seriously does the EU take Taiwan? And my answer to this would be not so seriously, it seems, unfortunately. And the thing I would point to here is that the EU is not very active in trying to curtail the growing tensions that we have seen in the past years in the Taiwan Strait. That's not to say that it's not committed to helping do so. We have this quote, for example, which the EU will use every available channel to encourage initiatives aimed at promoting dialogue, cooperation, and confidence building between the two sides of the Taiwan Strait. So there is some commitment, but for most of the past 5 years, besides some very, very careful statements issued by the European External Action Service, we haven't really seen much happen here. This has started to change in the past year with the EU and US rapprochement after the end of the Trump administration and the Biden administration's focus on Taiwan, as we can see, for example, in this quote from an US-EU summit statement made in June 2021. So we underscore the importance of peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait and encourage the peaceful resolution of cross-strait issues. That is important because it signals that the EU and the US want to make it clear to China, at least, that the growing instability there is dangerous to their interests and that they want to do something about it. But, and I don't think this is enough. And again, going back here to roles that Taiwan should be playing to the EU. And that is not only as a security issue to the EU, but also as a democracy which survival is worth defending. And this, of course, I think is based fundamentally in the fact that the EU aspires to be and is a normative power that champions democracy across the globe. And also the fact that, Chinese efforts to undermine democracy in Hong Kong and Taiwan is really a signal that it is willing to undermine both EU and US norms and values across the world. And this is not something that the EU should accept if it really is serious about protecting and defending its values. That's not to say that it doesn't, it says it wants to support the shared values underpinning Taiwan's system of governance, but it's this, again, it hasn't really done all that much so far. And of course, it wouldn't be fair to expect it to do so if there's nothing it could do. We know that the European Union is quite a careful, cautious, and in a sense, weak geopolitical actor. But I think, at least in the long term, that there is things that the European Union can do. And it brings us to this. The EU should and can help ensure the survival of Taiwanese democracy. And there are several options available for this. They may not be realistic right now, But if the EU really cares about Taiwanese democracy and democracy across the world, it's something that in the long term, in my opinion, it should consider and work towards. And there are several options. One thing is to push for dialogue. Live up to the commitment you made to push for confidence building. Is China going to bite for a major diplomatic offensive to see some communication resume across the Taiwan Strait? Not likely. It will see it as interference and will likely refuse. But it's worth the try. And it's worth the try especially because it could help China see that it needs an off-ramp from the very dangerous provocations that it is currently pursuing, which, as we all know, has not made Taiwan more likely to want to move closer to China or engage in dialogue with China. The second is this. In 2019, France said this frigate, the Vendémiaire, through the Taiwan Strait. If China won't negotiate, and if China is insisting on threatening both US and EU interests in the Taiwan Strait, then maybe this is something that the EU has to consider, or at least its member states. France has already taken some steps, as I've said, to do this. Germany is increasing its naval assets in the Indo-Pacific, is not likely to send it to the Taiwan Strait, but in my opinion, should consider it. Because if China is going to be as aggressive as it is, the EU should be helping out to deter it. And finally, and perhaps the most powerful thing the EU can do, but also the most difficult to advocate for, is this: first of sanctions. The EU is the most important trading partner to China. It wears an enormous economic clout, and it really could make an impact by making it clear that the supply chain damage, the economic damage that would happen from a conflict in the Taiwan Strait, and the damage it would make to EU values and interests would be unacceptable and would be met with sanctions from both the US and the EU. Again, likely, no, not, but something the EU should consider. In sum, closing, Taiwan matters to the EU, but not as much as it should. And there's a lot the EU should be doing, at least in my opinion, to do something about that and make Taiwan matter more. But as we all know, there are a lot of geopolitical, economic, and political interests, the China factor, in the way. And in the present moment, it's unlikely that things will change to a drastic extent, even given changing European opinions about Taiwan. That said, because we're here with the Taiwan Digital Diplomacy Association, which works with participatory diplomacy, I want to ask this question. Can you help? Is there anything we here as individuals can do to do something about this? And again, the easy answer is no. But I think the hard answer and the one we must be pursuing is yes. And what can we do as individuals? We can do this. We can be citizen diplomats. For Taiwanese people, get to know Europeans, travel to Europe, meet them online, tell them about Taiwan, its democracy, the threats that it faces. Many will care because Europeans do care about democracy. Some will even want to help. They may not be able to do more than join a friendship association, post on Facebook about Taiwan, or take the issue into consideration when they cast their vote for the European Parliament. But many small rivers make a big stream, and drops of rain can erode rock. And this is something that we need to do, because if enough people do it, politicians will have to listen. That is not only the promise, but also the fact of the democracy that Taiwan and Europe share. And it's the most important and the most powerful tool that we have to do something about this. And if Taiwan and the European Union are ever to grow closer, and if Taiwan is to be able to play the role in EU foreign policy that is really supposed to play, then this is something that we all need to do. And I'll leave it at that and leave it to our next speaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Philip, for making these powerful arguments to that Taiwan should matter, and Taiwan matters and should matter more to the EU, no matter on ground of economic interest, mutual share values, including democracy and the protection of human rights, environment, and other values, and security and strategic interest. And thank you especially for in your last presentation, you speak for the Taiwan Digital Diplomacy Associations. And from a Taiwanese point, we will have a tremendous admire for those young activists who just do that on the citizen diplomacy. To continue the discussion, let's welcome our second speaker, who is Zuza Anna Ferenczi, who is worker affiliated with the NGO Human Rights Without Frontiers. The floor is yours, Susan, please.
Thank you so much, Raymond, and thank you, Taiwan Digital Diplomacy Association, for inviting me to speak at today's panel, at today's event. It is my honor to contribute to my reflections, and hopefully we will have, and I'm sure we will have, a very constructive debate and exchange on such an important topic. And thank you also, Joseph, for presenting and raising awareness on such an important issue for Europe, for democracy, for Taiwan, and in general for the EU, if we speak of the European perspective here on human rights. So in my 20 minutes presentation, I will shortly share my screen here. And while I do that, right now, okay. I don't know, can you see my screen or not yet? Not yet, okay. Okay, share again. Well, there's a bit of an issue, but hopefully we'll fix it. So I try again. I'm not sure why it doesn't want to share my screen. Let's try it again. Oh, it says sharing. Can you see it now? Because the system tells me that it is no. Okay. Not sure why we have an issue, because for me it says that it's sharing.
We will try to play your presentation on our side.
Okay. Okay, apologies for that. I'm not sure why it doesn't want to cooperate with me. Okay, so no, now it says, I think now it's working.
It's working out. Yeah.
Okay, good. So, all right, so let me just go to the beginning. Oh, all right, apologies for that. I think it happens to the best of us. So, all right, so before I begin, though, I would just like to say a few words about my capacity to participate. So as Raymond suggested, I am affiliated with Human Rights Without Frontiers, which is a Brussels-based NGO focusing on human rights. For the past 30 years, we have had priority issues and geographical areas. China, of course, North Korea have been on top of our lists. And since we're talking about diplomacy here, public citizen diplomacy, and raising awareness, I think this will be very important going forward in our discussion on how we can indeed raise further awareness on these issues. And some of the points I will make will be, I think, very complementary to Philip's presentation. So I'm very happy to actually follow his presentation. It was very comprehensive. So I will try to bring additional elements to the same conversation, and also speak a little bit about my experience, because I worked for 12 years in the European Parliament, and I've seen from the inside a lot of how the European institutions work out their policies and how they manage their differences when it comes to China and Taiwan. And so this is just in the background. So human rights, the EU, Taiwan, and I argue that it is time to upgrade ties. So essentially, what I will do in the next 20 minutes is I will speak first a little bit about the EU as a normative power. Philip already mentioned this concept, but I think it's the most suitable concept to speak about the EU and frame it as an international actor when it comes to human rights, and connect this to the external dimension of normative power and how the EU acts on the world stage as a geopolitical power. And also to think a little bit about perceptions and self-perceptions. Of course, this is something that I think Raymond, yourself, and Joseph, you also mentioned how we most often Taiwan is perceived through the lens of the US-China competition. So a perception, self-perception when it comes to the EU are equally important. I will cover the EU-Taiwan relationship in connection with, but also on its own merit, with the EU-China relationship and where we stand. And to upgrade EU-Taiwan ties. So my main argument is that the EU needs a strategic debate on relations with Taiwan in the context of the ongoing reflections on our China policy, as well as our broader foreign policy ambitions. And I argue that internal unity and a broad international cooperation are both vital. So the EU as a normative power, well, for the past 3-4 decades, there has been a lot of debate on what the EU is and how it acts internally, domestically, and externally. And there has been a lot of effort to try to understand what we can expect from the EU as a normative power. And different theories have been out there, different descriptions or interpretations as a civilian power, a postmodern actor, a transformative power, but I think, or soft power, but I think the normative power concept really captures the essence of the EU externally and its behavior and its objectives to promote human rights, democracy, and rule of law as interconnected and mutually reinforcing principles in its foreign policy. But it is not enough to pursue these objectives overseas. It is important that there is a high level of respect of these same values at home. So to set an example of behaving in line with these standards is what normative power is about. And I think this is a very important point in our, should be in our discussion, because understanding what the EU is and what we can expect from the EU is where we should start analyzing how effective the EU is. There's a lot of discourse. So normative power concept and theories is all about discourse and narrative. But of course, these theories have shaped the discourse. And I think how it translates into action, of course, is what matters, as Philip also pointed out. So I think this is one main point I would like to highlight in the first half of my presentation. And also the second and related point is that the EU, we have to remember that the EU is in a way a unique international actor. It is not a country, it is an organization of 27 sovereign member states. There's no predecessor to the EU, no equivalent to the EU. And this is by no means to say that, well, it's unique and special, but it is to say that when we assess it, we need to understand that the fragmentation is a given. When we speak about what the EU can do with China, and we just easily, I think too often we just easily say, well, the EU doesn't do anything, or the EU doesn't do enough. Well, who in the EU do we actually mean, and how much is there that the EU can do? So just a bit of a nuance, I think, that sometimes is missing in the debate. So the EU as a normative power is defined by what it is, as I said, and also what it does. So discourse and action, the founding values as put down in the Lisbon Treaty in Article 2, as we all know, freedom, democracy, equality, and so on. And also the objectives are put forward in the Article 3 of the Lisbon Treaty is to contribute to the eradication of poverty, the protection of human rights, the rights of the child, and so on. I won't dwell too much on this. We also have different tools to advance human rights in the world. And of course, there's a long list of the different tools that the institutions have worked out throughout the years, but I would just mention here the 2012 Strategic Framework on Human Rights and Democracy that was followed by 3 sets of action plans. And here I would highlight the latest one that is in place, that covers the period of 2020 to 24, that prescribes the priorities for concrete action for the next 5 years. And it's also important to see how we see a process of maturing in terms of delivering on the objectives, on the narrative that is being shaped, because we're talking about more action that is required from the EU in terms of human rights promotion. And we saw that before these action plans came out, the EU committed to introduce a global human rights sanctions regime, which indeed happened. And this is to target individuals, entities, bodies responsible for, involved in, or associated with serious human rights violations and abuses worldwide, and including genocide, crimes against humanity. And so this is, I would highlight this as a significant step forward for the EU, and also putting it in practice when I will speak at a later stage about this when it comes to China. It is also a sign of a high level of awareness of the need to bridge that gap that exists between the discourse and action. And here, I thought I would bring in some color to the presentation. Well, it's not exactly a colorful picture here, but this is to say that in 2012, in line with the normative power concept and the achievements to promote human rights and democracy, as we know, in 2012, the EU received the Nobel Peace Prize. And this is not only a recognition of the EU's past achievements, but it also looks to the future. So I thought this is a useful element to bring into my presentation to sort of allow us to switch to the external dimension of the concept and the EU on the world stage. Because internally, of course, we know that the EU has been in a state of permanent crisis management since the 2008 global financial crisis, which was followed by a series of other crises, including Brexit, integration crisis, an unprecedented wave of migration that still needs to be dealt with, as well as an aggressive China, an aggressive Russia, an assertive China, but often we can also use, I assume, an aggressive China, a US reluctant to cooperate on global problems. So in the past years, this has been the context in which the EU has tried to take a bigger role globally, but being absorbed by these internal issues and also challenges on a global scale. The expectations were high, but the reluctance to take on a bigger role globally, there hasn't been as much progress on that front. The pandemic at the same time also underlined the EU's vulnerability to supply chains, and it inspired further discussion on the EU's role in the world. Then we have other growing threats to democracy, including disinformation, which Philip also touched upon. And so calls for a geopolitical EU have been on the rise, but there remains a reluctance and a difficulty, as I mentioned earlier, on the fragmentation and the multi-layered governance system that dominates the EU's operational capacity, is that we always have to remind ourselves that when we analyze how far the EU can go geopolitically, well, we have to look at every member state's contribution to the debate, the lack of it, resistance to go further. And given these challenges, I mentioned the long series of crises, these actually have led to more reluctance and more interest in national sovereignty away from the European discourse that is at the core of the EU. So here I think it's useful to remember, and I'm sure we've heard it a lot, but I'm using it for the sake of this discussion, that the High Representative of the European External Action Service, Josep Borrell, said in 2019 that as we see the rebirth of geostrategic competition between China, Russia, and the US, the EU has the option of becoming a player, a true geostrategic actor, or being mostly the playground. So the player versus the playground is sort of the line that stuck with us in our discussions on how fast and how far can a geopolitical EU be seen on the horizon. At the same time, Borrell in 2020 said that the role of the EU and the question of how it should deal with a China increasingly pursuing a strategy of global influence are issues of fundamental importance for our future. So this statement also inspired me to state that I think for the EU, China is central in its own global positioning and shaping its self-perception. Just like in the case of Taiwan, as we said, how we perceive Taiwan in Europe is important, and how we perceive ourselves and our own capacity is equally important in terms of achieving more geopolitical goals. So the tension, when we speak about these ambitions, the tension remains. And I might be coming back sometimes maybe obsessively to this, but I think it's very important to remember that it is not enough to say that, well, the EU is promising always a lot, but doesn't deliver. Well, let's really be clear what the reasons are. And I think if we have a very thorough understanding of that, that's where we can maybe be more constructive and see what works and what what steps taken have been actually effective, or how we can actually contribute to the debate. So let's turn quickly to the EU-Taiwan, EU-China, not necessarily at the same time, but given that I do not have much time in my presentation, I do want to make a point that I think it's time that we speak about EU-Taiwan and Taiwan on its own merit. But given the way I built up this presentation, I think it's helpful to sort of speak about the two relationships at the same time, almost in contrast. So EU-Taiwan, of course, we know like-minded partners sharing lots of objectives in terms of the promotion of fundamental values, and there is a normative convergence. There even human rights consultations, the last round took place in July this year. So there's clearly a strong common understanding of the importance of protecting these values domestically within the EU, as well as within Taiwan, and the role that each can play internationally for the cause of human rights. Now, this convergence is not present, of course, in the EU-China relationship. We've gone from being strategic partners, that was coined back in 2003, to considering China a systemic rival promoting alternative models of governance. So there is more of a divergence in normative terms. And this conceptual shift is unfolding within the EU to see China more as a threat and less as an opportunity. But again, when I say in the EU, the discourse is towards internal consensus, but we're not there yet. And I don't think it's a question of time, because I do not foresee that soon enough or at some point in the future, all member states will all agree on how to deal with China. There will always be differences because we are 27 different countries with different capacities, ambitions, experiences, and national perceptions on how we see the future. But there is clearly a shift unfolding, and there is a convergence to see China more as a threat. And this toughening stance that we see unfold in China, in Europe on China, provides a strategic opportunity, I argue, to reconceptualize and to upgrade the EU's relations with Taiwan. So the EU and the member states, again, I think it's important to say that it's member states, every single member state individually. We cannot expect Brussels to be doing something bigger and more when it comes to Taiwan if we do not have the support of every single member state. This is where, again, also I think awareness raising becomes important on Taiwan in the EU. And this was said at the beginning of our exchange, that this is about awareness raising as well. So the EU and member states must use this opportunity on two fronts: internally through this shift in the perception we see unfold in Brussels when it comes to China, and externally through the momentum of Taiwan's success and the recognition it has gained in global health and technology. Briefly on how I've seen in the past decades the European Parliament's work vis-a-vis China and Taiwan, I think this could be interesting and more of a practical contribution to the debate. In my view, and I believe I'm not alone in this, the European Parliament has become and has been the most vocal EU institution on China and Taiwan. There's different formats within the Parliament that focus on these two entities. So the EU-China delegation, for example, since 1979, now is being led by a German Green member of the European Parliament who's very outspoken on China. And I pause here for a second, because this in itself is an important detail, that we have a delegation that is a formal platform within the institution and is led by an MEP, a member of the European Parliament, who is willing to be so outspoken on China, is also something that we did not see in the past. So I will use actually a lot of examples that will be aimed or will seek to illustrate that shift that is taking place in the European Parliament as well. So we have a friendship group between the EU and China, which is an informal group, but this at the moment is suspended because there have been some issues with the leader of this group in the MEP who is being investigated. And then there's also the EU-Taiwan Friendship Group, another informal group that brings together MEPs. And this has served as a platform to raise awareness within the Parliament, within the EU, within Brussels, the institutions, as well as in the member states, on the importance of Taiwan to the EU. So there's been a long list of resolutions, statements, hearing, and different letters that were shared and articulated to raise more awareness on Taiwan. Here I'm using, for example, the example of the September 2020 initiative that was a letter published by Le Monde, the French paper Le Monde, that published a letter that proposed explicitly a new European Taiwan policy. This is a pretty clear evidence, or I would say illustration of the growing awareness within the EP on Taiwan and Taiwan's importance to the EU. This letter was signed actually by several members of the European Parliament, as well as a former ambassador, German ambassador to China, and Japan. So in itself, this is an example only. But again, when we look at the European Parliament, we look at the foreign policy of the EU and what Brussels can do in terms of foreign policy, we have to remember that the CFSP, or the Common Foreign and Security Policy of the EU, is driven by member states. So it is in their hands, in their national sovereignty. On the EU level, there is a decision to work towards common objectives, as Article 2 and 3 states in the Lisbon Treaty, as I mentioned. So we have to remember that. Here, I would use another good example of a higher or level of awareness and readiness to speak about Taiwan in the European Parliament. Here, I would mention the January 2021 report that the Parliament tabled on the Common Foreign and Security Policy of the EU, which for the first time has had a very strong language of Taiwan. Now, this is a report that comes out every year in which the Parliament presents its position and priorities on foreign policy broadly. And of course, it then focuses on specific issues. Usually, Taiwan is mentioned and usually one time urging the EU's support for Taiwan's membership in international organizations. But this time, for the first time, it mentions Taiwan 11 times exactly. And it says that it reaffirms the Union will remain vigilant regarding the upgrading of political and trade relations between the EU and Taiwan. It calls on the EU to revisit their engagement policy with Taiwan. So it's very strong and specific language, and we should not take this lightly. We should not overestimate this. Again, this is language, and I highlighted the importance of understanding how we can translate this language into action, but it all starts with this. This creates space for more debate, for more awareness, and that's why it's important to mention it. And on this note, I would mention that the European Parliament is also, for the first time ever, working on its own standalone report on Taiwan, which is something that usually we have reports on important partners or our strategic partners, such as Russia, China, India, the United States, and these come out annually or every 2 years. But we've never had one on Taiwan because Taiwan has always been part of the EU-China framework. So having a standalone report on Taiwan is also important. On China, of course, we've had for many years a lot of resolutions, a lot of statements, and I would, again, to illustrate the shift in the language of the resolution, I would highlight the December 2020 resolution on forced labor and the situation of the Uyghur in the Xinjiang Autonomous Region. And there's an interesting paragraph there at the end of the resolution that it says that the EP criticizes the procurement of thermal cameras from Hikvision by Parliament's administration and urges Parliament's administration and its president to immediately sever any direct or indirect business relationship with Hikvision. Well, 5-10 years ago, such language would not be present in an EP resolution on China. And the same MEP who I mentioned earlier, who's the leader of the EU-China delegation, he said that Hikvision is a technology company which is deeply complicit in the terrible oppression of the Uyghur people in Xinjiang, which borders on genocide. So I don't think I need to explain this, but it's a good illustration of on where we stand, because I did ask at the question at the beginning, where do we stand? So the mood in Taipei and I'm getting close to the end of my presentation here, but quickly, of course, what the EU can do vis-a-vis Taipei or Taiwan and with Taiwan in the current global context, we have to also look at what Taiwan can do and Taiwan should be doing given the circumstances or mindful of the challenges. But we do see clearly an interest in strengthening cooperation with the EU coming out of Taipei. The recent global pandemic and the situation surrounding it has also intensified contact. We've seen an exchange between Academia Sinica, Taipei's National Academy of Science, and health officials led by the EU representative to Taipei, Filip Grzegorczewski. So these are all very good initiatives that set a precedent for further intensified cooperation. In the context of the Indo-Pacific, of course, this is another big chapter to cover that I will not have time to speak about. But in this context, we do see that Taiwan's foreign minister said that Taiwan is ready to embrace the Indo-Pacific. Together, we can realize a free, open, inclusive, and resilient Indo-Pacific. Philip did mention also this concept and the fact that certain member states have pushed and played a more active role, namely France, Germany, the Netherlands. And a final thought on that is that I think, and this is something that needs further emphasis in Brussels, is that without Taiwan's participation, the Indo-Pacific strategy will not be truly inclusive. So how to upgrade ties, finally? Well, I think there is already an international consensus that China presents a threat to Taiwan's security. It is a source of regional anxiety. Again, this is where Philip and I think we do agree on the importance for the EU to do more and to go forward. And this is where I bring in that nuance to remember where we are and which institutions can play a bigger role and which institutions we can be expected to do more. Again, the Parliament is doing, I think, a lot, and that's what it's supposed to be doing. So this is why I give it credit. But again, it comes down to the willingness of member states, how far we will go. This is why there's a need for a strategic debate. It is important for the EU to present a united front when we deal with China. We also need to better understand China's political and economic system, its structural weaknesses and strengths. So again, this is also about awareness raising. And internationally, we need to work with like-minded partners. We know that the Summit for Democracy is scheduled for the end of the year. And the aim here is to defend against authoritarianism, fight corruption, and promote the respect for human rights. So on that note, I think I've used up my time, but I'm happy to come back to any elements I mentioned, and I hope and I look forward to the further presentations. Thank you for your attention.
Susan, for sophisticated dynamic internal and external factors with that attitude on one, and especially identifying political actors, especially European Parliament, and also arguing that the EU is a normative power, and there is a conceptual change toward the normative convergence between the EU and Taiwan. And our third speaker is Fu-Te Liao, the distinguished professor on human rights and international law in the Legal Institute for Legal Studies in Academia Sinica, and who Fu-Te will talk about the EU European human rights system and its impact and its relationship, its relevance to Taiwan. Fu-Te, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Reverend. Yeah, it's a great pleasure to work with you at this seminar or webinar. And I also like to thank Taiwan Digital Diplomacy Association for inviting me to this webinar, which is very interesting and very important to Taiwanese people. And as a law scholar, I think I will try to find to focus more on on legal issues. On legal issues. So allow me to try to show you my outline. Okay, I guess you can see my outline. It's okay. Okay. And I'll try to talk on the main thing that what I call try to bridge between Taiwan and European human rights system. And I will try to divide my talk into 4 parts. First part, I will try to explain what is European human rights system and what we call it. In fact, when we say European human rights system, it includes at least 2 parts. One is from Council of Europe, the other from European Union. But we are more familiar with European Union. But in fact, it is more important in terms of human rights standards. Council of Europe set most of the human rights standards at what we call the European human rights system. And it's also important that, in fact, our Council of Europe has 47 member states, and more importantly, including Turkey, Armenia, and Georgia. And the European Union has only 27 members, and all the 27 members are also member states of the Council of Europe. And what is important for Council of Europe is that it's try to set up human rights standards. I list some important human rights treaties that has adopted by the Council of Europe. For example, a European Convention on Human Rights. It also established a European Court of Human Rights. Now, European Court of Human Rights has been some angles, arguably the most advanced human rights court in the world. And but finally, at the last, we were talking about the case that Joseph has brought to the European Court of Human Rights. And the second, for example, European Social Charter, it also established a committee of independent experts to review collective complaints from the people in Europe. And the others, such as European Convention for the Prevention of Torture and Inhuman and Degrading Treatment or Punishment, and European Charter for Regional Minority Language, and the Convention on Action Against Trafficking in Human Beings, and also a Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence. And you can find it, it includes the first generation of human rights, European Convention on Human Rights, and the second generation European Social Charter, and also other very important issues of human rights. For example, against torture, also minority language, human trafficking, and also violence against women. And the second part of the European human rights system is established by the European Union. In fact, the very one important document is that the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union. And it also reviewed by the Court of the European Union to see whether the member state of the European Union can fulfill the Charter of the Fundamental Rights. But the more important is that I would say European Union is the most more important actor on human rights issues, or we can call it human rights policy to the world. And the second part, let me try to briefly explain what impacts has the European human rights system bring to the world. I think the first impact to the world is the original states, member states of the Council of Europe in Western European states. For example, the United Kingdom established the Supreme Court because there was a violation judgment, and the response state was the United Kingdom. So in fact, it's very interesting. The highest court of the UK, in fact, is because there is a violation judgment. So the UK tried to bring very significant impacts to the UK to establish a new Supreme Court. And the second example can be said in Germany. For example, German Constitutional Court has developed a so-called harmony policy or principles with the European Court of Human Rights. The reason for that was that because there were several violation judgments concerning Germany, and these cases were even reviewed by the German Constitutional Court. So there are different opinions and also conflicts between German Constitutional Court and the European Court of Human Rights. And the second impact to the world is toward Eastern European states, especially after 1990s, and then what we call third wave democracy. For example, the Council of Europe asked all the Eastern European states has to be a democracy state, has to abolish the death penalty before it become a member state of the Council of Europe. So you can find the third wave of the democracy movements in Eastern European states. And then now even Russia is a member state of the contracting state of the European Convention on Human Rights. And the third, it also brings very important impacts to regional human rights mechanism. For example, African Human Rights Commission and the Court, and also Inter-American Human Rights Commission and the Court. Because in the past, the European Convention on Human Rights has two mechanisms. One is European Convention on Human Rights. The other is European Court of Human Rights. But it was merged in 1998 into a permanent European Court of Human Rights. And in other regions, especially in Africa and America, they try to follow a European way, first to establish mechanism including Human Rights Commission and also Human Rights Court. And this is also moving forward. And the full impact is also very tremendous and very significant to the world. It includes UN treaty bodies, for example, Human Rights Committee, and also other treaty bodies, such as Committee on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights. They have these committees has made much reference to the judgments of the European Court of Human Rights. And of course, on the other part, the European Union also have very what we call the human rights dialogues with the different parts of the world, of course, including China, and also Caribbean states or Latin American states, and also African states. So my third part will bring our thinking back to Taiwan and the European human rights system. And you can find, in fact, both the Council of Europe and the European Union have much impacts on Taiwan. First, I'll try to mention about European Convention on Human Rights. The European Convention on Human Rights, in fact, has much influence on Taiwan. For example, the Constitutional Court of Taiwan, in their judgments, the Constitutional Court of Taiwan has made much reference to the European Convention on Human Rights and some decision and the judgments of the European Court of Human Rights. And even in domestic courts in Taiwan, they also try to make some reference to the European Convention on Human Rights. And one particular reason is that because in Taiwan, we have incorporated several UN human rights treaties into Taiwan. So some domestic courts not only make reference to the decision or the opinions from human rights treaties of the UN, but also some views and the judgments of the European Court of Human Rights. And third part of the influence of the European Convention on Human Rights is about academic thinking in Taiwan. I guess I myself is one of the very good example. In fact, the European Convention on Human Rights attracted me to England to learn more about some individual petitions to the European Court of Human Rights, which is the system that Joseph tried to work out with and try to protect his rights. I guess it's very insightful impacts to academic thinking in Taiwan, especially about the human rights thinking, human rights standards, and the human rights ambit. In Taiwan academic field, we have some works, papers, try to explain, to understand the judgment of European Court of Human Rights. And it has been going up. And more papers try to understand and explain or to learn from the judgments of the European Court of Human Rights. And the second part of impacts from the European human rights system is from the EU, especially the human rights consultation between EU and Taiwan since March 2018. And in this consultations, especially human rights constitutions, Taiwan and the EU exchange views on the universality of human rights, and they both sides, the two sides have been working and talk on several human rights issues. For example, death penalty and business human rights, and migrant workers' rights, especially in the fishing industry, and also national human rights institution, to name only four of them. But I would be trying to explain why these issues were brought to the table. Because that's very important reason is that because Europe, in the European side, the European states or the EU has been very much focused on these issues. For example, there's no disparity in EU. So the EU tried to bring these very important issues in every human rights consultations and dialogues. So the main issue is that the European Union tried to ask or urge Taiwan to abolish the death penalty. And for the business and human rights, because European states is the most many states in the world who have adopted their national action plan on business and human rights. And for the national human rights institutions, it's also the similar situations. So maybe we have to try to think one very important issue. Is this a one-way consultation between Taiwan and the EU? By saying the one-way consultation, I try to say that it could be the situation that it's only the EU to ask or urge Taiwan to do something to implement universal human rights standards. But it does not go the other way. Taiwan never asked the EU to fulfill their obligations under international human rights treaties or under even the European human rights systems. It's not fair to me, at least. For a human rights law scholar, universal human rights standard is universal human rights standard. You have the right to ask, or you have the right or power to ask Taiwan to implement, to fulfill the universal human rights standards. But at the same time, Taiwan also have the power and the right to ask European states, especially in the EU, to fulfill their universal human rights obligations. So that's what we call universal human rights standards. But it's regret that I never heard that from Taiwan's part to ask the EU to do something to fulfill their human rights obligations. And that shouldn't be the situation. That what we call human rights consultations. It should be two ways of consultations to express views of both sides, to ask the other side to do something to fulfill a common universal human rights obligations. So the fourth and the last part, I will try to mention two cases. One is the extradition of suspects of telecommunications fraud to Beijing, especially in EU member states. For example, in Spain, Spain extradites, what I remember is more than 20 suspects, Taiwanese suspects to Beijing. But from a human rights law scholars' view, and from the views of the European Convention on Human Rights, if a person is subject to torture and not protected by fair trial, under these situations, a person should not be extradited to the countries that the person may suffer from this torture or unfair trial. Everyone can imagine that. Anyone, and it's mostly possible to be tortured, and no fair trial can be guaranteed in China. But Spain also extradites these suspects, Taiwanese suspects, to Beijing. In my view, it's very obviously against Article 3 of the European Convention on Human Rights. In fact, I myself have had one opportunity to join the consultation, human rights consultation between the EU and Taiwan, and I bring this issue to the table. Unfortunately, I did not get any answer from the EU side. And it's not fair, and it's not a very comfortable situation. Not a very comfortable situation. That's the one example that I think we should bring the table to the consultation, human rights consultation, and let EU member states know that's the important issues for Taiwanese people. And the second case, allow me to go to Joseph's case, which is what we call the Leo and others versus Norway in the European Court of Human Rights. And if you have an opportunity or any chance to read this in-admission decision, you can find, and I try to quote this decision is in fact manifested ill-founded inadmissible decision in the name of manifested ill-founded, because it tried to make an inadmissible decision in the name of manifested ill-founded, but without any reason. In fact, it concerns private life, a very important human rights issues in the European Convention on Human Rights. In any way, if any judge of the European Court of Human Rights want to make an inadmissible decision, should write some reasons. So my opinion is that there is no reason. There is no reason for this decision. So but it's very regrettable. It's very regrettable. And my final conclusion is that, in fact, Taiwan has incorporated in international human rights treaties. We try to understand the European human rights system, and we can say that we try to bring international human rights standards into Taiwan domestically. But what we did not have or haven't had is that we have no opportunity to bring Taiwan back to the international human rights arena, and including European human rights arena. So what we need to do is try to understand it more and try to bring Taiwan to the international human rights arena, including European one. So that's my final conclusion and my first time opinion. If we have opportunity, we will try to discuss more issues. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Futa, for this fascinating presentation about the reality of human rights scene, or what we say shared values between the EU and Taiwan, and which is fascinating about the push and pull of EU to Taiwan and no vice versa. And we have already, I think the common things. I think the three speakers who presented it to us not only the rosy pictures, no rosy pictures at all. Philip said about that Taiwan should get more attention and emphasize, but not getting it. And Susa talked about the internal and the external factors influence the EU decision, and Futa talked about the reality of the human rights thing. We already got 6 questions addressed to the 3 speakers. The first one is raised by Yi Ting in Chinese from YouTube, who says that, do you think, Philip, that the rapid advance of Taliban in Afghanistan influenced the EU's view on Taiwan? That's the first question. The second one is raised by Hui Yu, about the cooperation. That the first part is about the EU's emphasis on the sustainable development goals and whether it opens opportunities for the more closer cooperation with the East Asia countries. And also ask Philip about whether the Taiwan can get a closer tie with Sweden. The third one is raised by Eric. It's an interesting one. Does Philip think EU starts its actual cooperation with Taiwan due to the pressure from China? Due to the pressure from the US, I'm sorry, due to whether EU started its actual cooperation with Taiwan due to the pressure from the US. The fourth one raised by Rick, who's asked Susa especially, how can Taiwan and the EU work together to address human rights abuses in mainland China? The fifth one is about also addressed to Susa. You mentioned that the European countries should revisit its engagement with Taiwan. How do the European countries put that into action, and how long will it take? The sixth one raised by Jessica is about what's the most effective way to protect Taiwanese identity rights in Europe after this inadmissible decision? Actually, I have another one from Kevin. The seventh one addressed to Fute also. How to solve a legal case problem like Liu and others versus Norway that's highly political sensitive? Is it a zero-sum game? Also, a new question from Frodo. How can we participate in diplomatic issues through any ways? Okay, let's address those 7 questions, and I think starting from you, Philip, please.
Sure, let's do it. So for the first question about Afghanistan, do I think this impacts EU perspectives on Taiwan directly? No, I don't think so. However, we need to consider the indirect effects of what the Taiwan fiasco, what effects it has had on the EU's military credibility, right? And we have seen this over the past couple of days with various commentators in the US and in Taiwan and in Europe, speculating about whether the US's catastrophic failure in Afghanistan with respect to the Taliban, whether that undermines US credibility. And I think it remains up in the air whether or not that impacts the U.S. unspoken, defense relationship with Taiwan via the Taiwan Relations Act. But at the same time, I think it's important to keep in mind that to the extent that the U.S. is not seen as a credible deterrent to Chinese military power in the Taiwan Strait, that creates a lot of geopolitical instability. And it also removes, I think, a base of stability from which the EU can act with respect to Taiwan. Because to the extent that the US is a stabilizing military force in the Taiwan Strait, that creates some conditions during which the EU is capable of acting in this way, right? So that's what I would say to that question. With respect to the Sustainable Development Goals question, I'm not an international development expert by any means, so I'm not sure I can comment generally on European Union foreign policy and sustainable development goals with East Asian countries. What I can say is that, again, the Sustainable Development Goals represent foreign policy priorities and goals which Taiwan and the European Union can share, and which their cooperation could help promote, not only in their own bilateral relations, but also in the wider Asian region. And this again goes back to what I said about the notion of connectivity, right? Because if we look at the sustainable goals, we have many of those that are relevant to issues that Taiwan and the EU are working with. For example, Sustainable Development Goal number 9 with respect to industry, innovation, and infrastructure. Creating connections, transport, human, and digital is a major part of both the EU's Connecting Europe and Asia strategy, and also to an extent to Taiwan's effort to create connectivity through initiatives like the new southbound policy. So there are common goals there that are important to promote. And again here, I would like to point to the Global Training and Cooperation Framework, which also has touched on issues that have to do with sustainable development goals. The Netherlands, for example, participated in a GTCF workshop on cleaning up marine debris, which of course can be connected to several sustainable development goals, like affordable and clean energy, responsible consumption and production. So again, here we see that there are opportunities for cooperation and synergies, and have taken part of Taiwan's expertise, which is important to the global discussion about the Sustainable Development Goals, and that the EU has an interest in promoting and racing on the global agenda. So again, there are opportunities for cooperation here that the EU should be pursuing, and that honestly, it has no reasons not to pursue. Because when it comes to the One China policy, cleaning up marine debris is not really anything that we should be worried about. And honestly, I don't know if it's anything that China would be all that worried about either. So interesting question, and I think it's something that needs to be discussed more thoroughly. For the second part of your question, who are you, with respect to Sweden and Taiwan? The prospects of creating a bilateral tie between Sweden and Taiwan, in the sense that, is Sweden going to abandon its One China policy and recognize Taiwan? No, that's not going to happen. It's not going to happen unless there is a major shift on the European level with respect to discussing and overhauling the European Union's One China policy, which is not really in the cards right now. So that's not going to happen. On the other hand, again, as I discussed in my presentation, there is room for countries like Sweden to develop their ties with Taiwan in a way that is not overly provocative towards China, but that still respects the fundamental and leverages the fundamental commonalities that Sweden and Taiwan share. And I think human rights is an obvious issue in this case. Sweden has regular consultations with Taiwan, the so-called Joint Business Council, with respect to business and economic issues. I don't really see an obstacle for deepened human rights dialogue between Sweden and Taiwan, especially since the European Union already has that kind of discussion going on. So I think there's more space for bilateral dialogue there. The problem is, of course, that especially for a small country like Sweden, which really doesn't want to rear its head, it can be very difficult to make those sort of bilateral ties and bilateral initiatives. And that is why Sweden, like many other small European countries, mainly conducts its Taiwan policy under the aegis of the European Union. So no, I don't see great prospects for deepening bilateral ties between Sweden and Taiwan, but I would like to note that there is a groundswell of opinion shaping and advocacy for Taiwan and Sweden-Taiwan relations in Sweden. One think tank that I have worked with, the Stockholm Free World Forum, has released reports about this, and a lot of op-eds arguing for this. There's another think tank called Arena Idea, which has really seized on this issue of Taiwan as a threatened democracy. And I think that's going to continue because, the more threatened Taiwan's democracy is, the more people in democracy-loving countries like Sweden are going to care about Taiwan. So again, I point to the importance of think tank, citizen diplomacy. It's important. It needs to happen. And we can all do our part to make that's more important. Another question, do I think the EU started its actual cooperation with Taiwan due to the pressure from the US? I think the US-EU statement that statement about Taiwan. I think that was largely driven by the US. I'm not sure. We saw, for example, when the G7 did that earlier, that Germany and France were quite reluctant actually to have that statement in there in the Cornwall statement when the G7 met in Cornwall. So there's some resistance to that, and I think that points to the very important role actually that the US needs to play in making the EU play a stronger, take a stronger stance with respect to Taiwan, right? Because as Susa said, the European Union is quite divided, and a problem of that division is precisely that it lacks, strong leadership in many of these issues, and that it's divided in that sense. The US, I think, can play, although there are obstacles to that, can play a more constructive role in pushing the European Union to take a stronger role on Taiwan, and that needs to happen. Though with respect to cooperation in issues like climate change, human rights, labor issues, I think that sort of cooperation developed even during the Trump administration, and I think it's hard to say that the Trump administration was a very active actor in getting the European Union to take a stronger stand on Taiwan. So I think that was largely internal and driven by the commonalities that in fact do exist. So no, I don't think the US is largely very strong pressure on this, but it should be, and it needs to be. Although it's important to say in that context as well that the US needs to be careful and patient with the European Union, again, because it has a much more antagonistic and geopolitical relationship with China that the European Union doesn't share. So there are obstacles there, but the US should play a more important part. I think, were those all the questions that were posed to me, or have I missed any?
I think that's all. Thank you, Philip.
Great. Thank you very much.
Susa, it's your turn about human rights in China and also about the EU countries' engagement with Taiwan. Susan, are you online? Susa, are you online? Hello. Turn on your mic.
Probably I can be the second one to respond if Susa is not available now.
Please, Futa.
Okay,
go ahead.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I think Dr. Susa could be the last one and the most important one to respond to all the questions. So I'll be the second one. Yeah. I'm very sorry that I cannot remember all the questions, but I do remember two. One is about how to solve the legal case problem, like a loose case, and because that's highly political sensitive. But I'm trying to explain that the system of the European Court of Human Rights. In fact, there are different kinds of political sensitive for European Court of Human Rights. Another one is that because it's the European Court, there are some sensitivity between European Court and the member states of the member state of the European Convention on Human Rights. So there is one principle we call the margin of appreciation. If there are no European consensus, the European Court of Human Rights try to give margin of appreciation to member states. So it's changing. It's always changing, and the European Court will be different attitude to similar cases. So my personal view is that for the cases similar to Joseph's case, it could be changed. It could be changed, but not at least not now, because there is no appeal of the decision of the inadmissible decision of Joseph's cases. The cases SN at this moment before the European Court of Human Rights, but there could be different cases are coming to the European Court of Human Rights, and there could be changed. The view could be changed. It happened in the past decades. in the past decades. And the other question is about, is there a most effective way to protect Taiwanese identity rights in Europe after this inadmissible decision? I am not quite sure what is the most effective way to protect, but I do believe there are some ways, as Joseph has mentioned. In fact, different European states have a different view at the registration of nationality. Some European states have already used the name of Taiwan. So it's different. It's different in different European states, and the date can be changed. For example, in the United States, they use Taiwan as the nationality for people in Taiwan. So I do believe that it's changing, and it could be more and more European states to understand and use Taiwan as the name for the nationality. And I tried also to mention that because European states joined many UN human rights treaties, including Norway. Norway has joined several very important UN human rights treaties, and Norway has accepted several monitoring mechanisms, including Human Rights Committee, the Committee for the Elimination of Discrimination Against the Racial Discrimination, or CEDAW, discrimination against the women. So there are still possibility to bring the case to the UN monitoring, human rights monitoring system. But I have to say, it is not necessary to be successful, but they still have opportunity to bring the case to the international human rights arena. Because thanks Norway. So Norway is a quite good example, who has joined many international human rights treaties. So I will try to respond to these two questions, and I will leave the floor back to the chair.
Thank you, Futa, for those thoughtful answers. And I think Susa is back online now. Yeah, please.
Yes, I'm here. Apologies again, technical problems. So thank you for the questions. The first one I would address, there was a question concerning how can Taiwan and the EU work together to address human rights abuses in mainland China? I think, as I mentioned in my presentation, I think what we lack in Europe is a thorough understanding of China and the complexities and the challenges, the strengths and the weaknesses. And I think in this regard, closer cooperation with our Taiwanese partners can be of great value, and also in helping us address those human rights violations that are taking place inside China. Well, of course, access to China is a problem, and I think working together with our Taiwanese partners, and this, I mean, an exchange on the level of civil society, but also city diplomacy, I think, is a very useful tool. I think through city diplomacy, we can connect city to city, and also what a city means and what a city can bring. So this means communities of scholars, of citizens. And again, I go back to the initial thought of raising awareness, that it is through higher levels of awareness that we can actually put more pressure on governments to act and to live up to the discourse that they put out on a daily basis. So I think city diplomacy, I mentioned NGOs, and this is where I would bring in again my experience with working closely with a very well-established human rights NGO in Brussels. And we have, I would say, contributed to bringing visibility to a lot of issues within the European Parliament. So I think here, Joseph, I think the way forward in terms of your struggles and the issue that you shed light on, I think turning to the European Parliament and using that as a platform for visibility would be a very effective way. And I'm happy to discuss this with you privately to see how we can shed light on this issue through the platforms of the European Parliament, and to reach out to identifying, well, it's a complex work, of course, to work with public institutions. And I understand that, and I do not mean to speak with, to make it sound like it's an easy affair. I know access, it is an issue. I know that the Parliament is often busy with trying to be present in too many issues, but speaking specifically on this issue, I think there is a way, and I mentioned the friendship group, for example, the EU-Taiwan friendship group that has committed to increase contact and cooperation both in economic and political terms. So this, given that our talk today does try to raise awareness and look forward on how to address this issue, because this is something that remains not well understood. Like you, Joseph, you mentioned how different member states deal with this differently. You mentioned Spain and Norway outside of the EU, but also Romania. So I think your expertise is very much needed for institutions, because this is the kind of beautiful relationship that can actually be established between institutions like the European Parliament that provide the platform for the NGOs that bring that knowledge. So Human Rights Without Frontiers has had that good cooperation with lots of MEPs. So I suggest that we discuss that. So moving on to the next question that I've had, that calls for the EU and member states to revisit the engagement policy with Taiwan. How do I think that this can be done, and how long does it take normally for the EU and member states to meet consensus? Well, it's a good and specific question. Of course, it really depends on the issues we're talking about. Here, we're talking about Taiwan and we're talking about China. And just as I mentioned in my presentation, China remains a strategic but very challenging partner. For today's conversation, where we mentioned that China is now a systemic rival, but it took years to reach consensus on what this label, on say embracing this label for China. So it does take years for a lot of issues for us to see progress. But this is what I often say when we try to assess what does, for example, that report that I mentioned on Taiwan, a standalone report, what does, how much benefit does that bring, or how important is that one report? And this is where I always say that it is a process. Every single resolution, even if these resolutions and this report, this specific report is not going to be legally binding. It's not going to force or say oblige the EU or the institutions to do certain things, but it will raise awareness. Again, it will put pressure on the different institutions to have that strategic debate, to move forward on the discussion on the bilateral investment agreement that is foreseen. So it takes time, but I think in this specific case with Taiwan and the engagement policy and revisiting that engagement policy, the discourse that is already there from members of the European Parliament in the resolutions to revisit, and specific explicit calls to do that, I think that already created the space for the debate. So for the foreseeable future and the near future, I expect that Taiwan will be again more frequently on the agenda of the Parliament on its own merit, but also in the context of the EU-China debate. And I think, and to finish on that note, it's actually useful to use that momentum in the EU-China debate on being tougher and equip ourselves with tools to protect our economic interests and political interests, and to have more of a space reserved for Taiwan in that regard. So I think this is what I would say to those questions.
you, Susan. And I have another question from Mark Wood, who asked, what are your thoughts on the impact of RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, which includes China, South Korea, Japan, and 12 other countries on EU-Taiwan and EU-China relations. And due to time limit, I also, if you have something to say about the impact of RCEP, please feel free. And I also want to, if there's no other questions coming up, I will also invite our three speakers to express your core messages in 1 minute for your what do you want most to address to conclude this today's conversation. And may I suggest to us to start from Philip, please?
Yeah, so with respect to RCEP, with respect to EU-China relations, I'm not a big fan of RCEP, I have to say. The basic problem with EU-China relations there, of course, is that it provides China with a geo-economic advantage, in the sense that to the extent that China was a driving force behind that agreement, and to the extent that that agreement lacks many of the important safeguards with respect to human rights, for example, it reflects a sort of a diminishing effect on the European Union's standard-setting role within the economic sphere in Asia. And that, of course, is sad with respect to, as the EU has committed to promoting its own values in that region. And I think, again, it really highlights the importance of the EU continuing to strike up strong economic partnerships, formalized, that are rule-based, that reflect Western liberal, well, universal economic liberal values, I should say, at least I think they are. And in that endeavor, the EU needs to seek partnerships not only with countries like Japan and South Korea to ensure that they remain firmly within the scope and firmly supportive of the kind of frameworks and structures that the EU prefers and supports, but also Taiwan, because Taiwan is a country, excluded as it is, that should be an important actor in promoting those kinds of values in the region, which are not really promoted by the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. So that's what I would say about that. With respect to my core message, it's pretty simple. The EU has its values. Taiwan shares those values. Taiwan can be a good partner to promoting those values, and it should be a partner to promoting those values. Currently, the EU doesn't really allow Taiwan to play that role in its foreign policy to the extent that it should. Things need to happen. That needs to happen. And to make sure it happens, we all need to play an active role in citizen diplomacy, and as Zusa said, in city diplomacy, in parliamentary diplomacy, and in digital diplomacy. And that's what needs to happen.
Excellent. Thank you, Philip. Susa?
Yes, thank you. I would quickly pick up also the question on RCEP, and also bring into the discussion, maybe not so much in line with what Philip said in terms of China's role in it, but also to shed light on ASEAN's role in it. And I think this sheds light on how the EU needs to recognize that there's more to Asia than China, and that working closely with partners in Asia other than China is increasingly not just important but vital. So ASEAN's centrality in RCEP has played out. We need to work with these partners. We need to work with India more closely, and it's good to see that there's the progress on that front. Yes, I think this is all I would say. Of course, I agree with Philip on the lack of those standards contained in the RCEP that the EU as a normative power in line with international standards has put forward in its own connectivity strategy. So it's also good to see that we've gone beyond just opposing alternative authoritarian models of governance, rightly so, but it's important to go beyond opposing and providing the right alternative. So I think this is somehow slowly taking shape with the United States. And so quickly, that's what I wanted to add on RCEP. Thank you for the question, Mark. And then on my thought, well, again, Philip makes it easy for me because he speaks in front of me. I just add on to what he says. So Philip said that Taiwan can and should be a partner, but the EU does not exactly enable Taiwan to play that role. I would say that Taiwan is already a partner. And I would also say that we should do more to facilitate a stronger role for Taiwan. Raising awareness, the theme on my end in a way to this debate is important. That's why more contact and more practical cooperation to intensify what we already have on one hand, and on the other hand, to come up with new areas of cooperation. Global health and tech, transparency, trust, all these issues are very important for the future. So that's what I would add. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. And Futa, please.
I'll try to be very briefly. First of all, concerning the RCEP, my personal view is that the RCEP will worsen the human rights situations in the region and even to the world, because business and human rights never came to the mind of RCEP. They never focus on the business and human rights ideas, and they never talk about the labor rights, the environmental issues, never. And the second part of my final conclusions or my view, my very final view is that I share the Philip's view that, and my suggestion is that if the EU and the European member states or other European states are smart enough, they will take Taiwan as a very good partner and also a base. If they try and want to focus on the issues in the region, especially in Asia and especially in Hong Kong and China, if they smart enough. Thank you.
Thank you, Futa. And today's discussion sits in an interesting intersection in two aspects. One is from the intersection from between international regional politics and domestic politics. Among them, the civil society's forces are particularly emphasized today. The second intersection is about time. In Taiwan, we develop more and more mature democracy and values on human rights and rule of law, which is shared by the US and many European countries. And Taiwan is getting more and more emphasized to being dealt with as Taiwan, as a modern democracy compared to other countries. So today we are demonstrating this fascinating dynamics before you, and we thank the four excellent speakers and the TDDA for making this possible and for all your participation. And lastly, may I invite anyone and everyone who wants to open their camera and can do this, and we can take a snapshot to commemorate this occasion.
So a group photo?
Yes, a group photo. Sorry. Thank you for putting it more simply for me. Yeah, please, everyone, please open your.
Joseph, we need a Taiwan bear.
Shall we? Can we? So I will count to 3. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Okay, another one. 1, 2, 3. Okay, thank you. Due to time limit, I have to close the discussion now. But please do contact with, pay attention to the webpage of TDDA. We'll have more events coming up. Thank you. And let's join me to applause for our 4 speakers. Thank you so much for your thoughtful. discussion. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Thank you. We will see you again online or in person. Thank you so much.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks. Great
nice week.
discussion.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye. Night or good evening or anything.
Thank you.
So I'm leaving. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you so
you.
much. 谢谢老师。
Fantastic.
谢谢。
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Philip.
Successful.
It's our pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye. Stay in touch.
See me?
Yes. Stay
Okay.
in touch.
Okay.
Bye.
Yeah. For people in Taiwan, good night.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.